Chapter 126 Trap. I am 15 chapters ahead on my Patreon, check it out if you are interested. patur-on.com/emperordragon. Chapter 126 Trap. The forest lay in a heavy stillness as Lucas approached the wall, each step muffled by the damp earth beneath his boots. The air was cool, laced with the faint chill of early morning, and the sunlight had only just begun to pierce the canopy. Pale beams of light broke unevenly through the trees, scattered by mist that clung low to the ground like a ghost unsure of its place. Shadows stretched long and thin between the trunks, distorted and uncertain. He paused at the boundary, the stone wall half swallowed by moss and creeping vines. Without hesitation, Lucas jumped over it. And the moment he did, the atmosphere changed. His senses flared. It wasn't the silence itself that alarmed him, forests had their quiet moments, but the quality of it. It was too precise. As if the entire woods were holding its breath. No rustling of leaves, no chittering of insects, no distant calls of birds. Just that heavy, unnatural hush. The figure had passed through here. He felt it in the shift of the air, in the faint, almost imperceptible tremble of the ground beneath his feet. The scent in the air had changed too, the earthy tang of overturned soil, the faintest impression of movement, and underneath it all, a sharp, acrid note. Chemical. Wrong. It slithered just beneath the clean scent of pine, barely noticeable unless you knew what to look for. Lucas dropped into a crouch, one hand brushing over the forest floor. His fingers moved slowly, methodically. There, a shallow indentation in the soil. Not a full footprint, not even a proper track. More like the memory of weight. A suggestion. A whisper. He narrowed his eyes. That was strange. Up until now, the figure had left no traces. None. It had moved like a ghost through these woods, never disturbing so much as a leaf. And now, a trail. Not carelessness. Intentional. Deliberate. A message. He exhaled, quiet and slow. You want me to follow, he murmured under his breath. His voice was little more than a breath of sound. Fine. And with that, he moved. The path was subtle but unmistakable to someone who knew how to read it. A broken blade of grass here, a tuft of moss disturbed there, the barest imprint of passing. It led him away from the estate's boundary and into the deeper forest, where the trees grew denser, their branches knitting together overhead to block out the sky. Light dimmed. The temperature dropped. Here, the forest felt older, primal, untouched. The birds did not sing here. Even the wind seemed reluctant to pass through. Lucas moved with a predator's grace, silent, focused, every footfall placed with care. His body remembered this kind of pursuit. He had trained for it, lived it. But more than that, he knew what this was. A lure. A provocation. A trap. And yet, he didn't stop. He followed the trail not because he was careless, but because he understood something deeper. Sometimes, the only way to catch the spider is to walk willingly into the web. The trail curved gently through a narrow pass between oak and pine, leading into a clearing that opened with unsettling abruptness, as if the trees themselves had been pushed back. He stepped into the open, and the silence thickened. The world held still. Lucas's gaze slowly flicked upward. He had already sensed the trap beforehand. He saw it a fraction of a second before it dropped, a glint of dull metal falling from the treetops above. Something cylindrical. The device burst in midair with a hiss like an angry serpent, expelling a thick, yellow gas that flooded the clearing in an instant. It curled low around his boots, then rose like smoke in a windless room, obscuring everything. The stench hit him first, pungent, metallic, laced with something bitter that made the back of his throat tighten. Wolfsbane. Not just the wild variety that grew in the hills, this was a rarer, more potent strain. Alchemical. Enhanced. The toxin bit into the air with an edge meant to cripple, meant to kill. Lucas coughed once, deliberately, and let his knees fold beneath him. He dropped to the ground beside a tree trunk, slumping against it as if overcome. His breathing turned shallow, ragged, just enough to sell the lie. Inside, his body was still. Calm. Unaffected. The poison didn't work on him anymore. Not since the change. Not since he had embraced what he truly was, a true alpha, in mind, body, and soul. So this was the plan. A cheap trick, dressed up with theatrics. Let's see how close you're willing to get, he thought. And then the silhouette appeared. It emerged slowly from the edge of the haze, a dark figure moving with deliberate ease. Cloaked in black, tall, their face hidden beneath the shadow of a hood. The mist curled around them like smoke, already dissipating as the figure walked closer. Lucas didn't move. He kept his body slack, his eyes half-lidded, breath still coming in shallow pulls. Playing the part. The figure stopped just a few paces away. Watching. Studying. Measuring. Lucas felt it, the presence, the attention, the weight of intent behind that stare. They were testing him. He waited. Perfectly still. Heartbeat slowed to a near stop. A wolf playing dead. Biding its time. The trap had sprung. But not the one the figure thought. The hunter had stepped into reach. And now, Lucas thought, as the last tendrils of mist disappeared from the clearing, let's see who you really are. Chapter 127, Puppet. The morning fog clung to the forest like a shroud, thick and slow-moving, hanging in the air with the heaviness of breath held too long. Around Lucas, the yellow mist curled and drifted in idle spirals, lazy and haunting, like smoke from a fire long since dead but not forgotten. It coated his skin with moisture, cooled his lungs with every careful breath. Then the figure emerged. It moved with unhurried steps, each one pressing deliberately into the damp, uneven earth. The sound of boots crunching wet leaves and soft soil broke the stillness like glass cracking under pressure. The figure stopped just a few feet away, not close enough to touch, but near enough that the weight of its presence settled on Lucas's chest like a second gravity. Then, with a motion so measured it was almost ceremonial, the figure reached up and lowered its hood. What it revealed was startling in its lack of drama. Just a man. Not a monster, not a demon cloaked in illusion, but someone completely ordinary. Average height. Unremarkable build. His hair was thinning, his features plain. The kind of man you could pass on the street a dozen times and never remember. A face like background noise. A ghost of someone who never mattered. And somehow, that made it worse. Lucas's gaze narrowed slightly, though he kept his posture slumped, his breathing shallow. Still pretending. Still wearing the mask of exhaustion, still playing the role of the hunted, a young man worn down, caught, vulnerable. But his eyes never left the man's. The stranger smiled, just a slight upturn of the lips. Casual. Effortless. It was the kind of smile you gave an old acquaintance on a park bench, not someone trapped in the woods. His voice matched the smile. Light, conversational, disturbingly calm. Did you enjoy my little gift? He asked, gesturing vaguely to the fading yellow mist that still drifted through the undergrowth like poison fog. Took some effort to acquire that particular strain, you know. Lucas exhaled through his nose, slow and steady, and let his head rest back against the rough bark of the tree behind him. His limbs stayed loose, his expression heavy with feigned fatigue. All this trouble, he said dryly, just for me. The man chuckled. It was low and uneven, a broken sound, like a record turning too slow on an old player. Something about it scraped the edges of reality. You're quite the anomaly, Lucas. So young, yet so powerful. When I learned of you, I had to change everything. The smile widened, just slightly, and something about it was wrong. Not in the way of monsters with sharp teeth and twisted features, but wrong in its perfection. Too even. Too practiced. Like a copy of a smile drawn from memory. You've made things interesting, he said. I can't tell you how long it's been since someone surprised me. I look forward to learning what you're hiding inside that mind of yours. As he stepped forward, the mist curled away from the soles of his boots, the last tendrils of wolfsbane dissipating into the earth. The temperature around them seemed to dip. His voice lowered now, almost intimate. But I suppose I'm getting ahead of myself. Lucas didn't respond, didn't flinch, didn't blink. He simply watched, and waited. Then, he felt it. Not through his eyes, but through the deeper senses, the ones that saw what sight missed. Beneath the man's surface there was nothing. There was no heartbeat beyond the mechanical rhythm of blood being pushed through veins. No sparks of neural activity dancing behind the man's eyes. No emotional static in the air. Nothing that suggested presence. Nothing that suggested life. The body in front of him was empty. Still. Silent in the way a tomb is silent, not just quiet, but hollow. Lucas's gaze sharpened, the muscles in his face barely tightening. The void he sensed was absolute, not dormant, not hidden, but absent. What stood before him wasn't thinking. Wasn't feeling. And then, he saw it. Just beneath the collar of the stranger's shirt, barely visible against pale skin, something shifted. A flicker of motion where there should have been stillness. It pulsed faintly, dark and slick, a vine-like organism, wrapped around the spine like a parasite with purpose. It twitched once, almost eagerly, then went still again. Alive. And absolutely not human. The truth hit Lucas with the icy clarity of a blade. He's dead. No brain activity. No consciousness. No soul. The body was just a vehicle, piloted by something else entirely. A puppet. Lucas let his head tilt to one side, letting his lips curl into a tired smirk. He masked the realization behind a lazy smile, soft enough that it could pass as resignation. So, that's your secret, he murmured, voice barely above the wind, meant only for the listening trees. The figure in front of him tilted its head in return, a mirror of curiosity, except, not. It mimicked interest, but there was no true emotion behind it. Like a puppet programmed to respond to cues it didn't understand. The air between them went still. The forest knew something unnatural stood there, something pretending to be alive. Lucas stayed perfectly still, waiting, his mind already calculating what to do next. Chapter 128. Empty. The forest had fallen into an unnatural hush, the kind that made even the wind seem hesitant to pass through the branches. It was as though the vast canopy above had become a theater, and every leaf, every hidden creature in the undergrowth, was holding its breath in anticipation of what might unfold. No birds sang. No insects hummed. The quiet pressed in all around, dense and unbroken, a suffocating stillness that gnawed at the edges of Lucas's awareness. In that suffocating silence, the figure stood over him, casting a long, jagged shadow across the dirt and leaf litter. It watched him with unsettling poise, wearing a grin that felt less like a smile and more like an empty mask, hollow, cold, and without the warmth of human intention. If the wolfsbane blend has done what I intended, the figure remarked, its voice carrying an almost casual tone, as if discussing the weather, you should be paralyzed from the neck down by now. Lucas remained as he was, slumped against the gnarled trunk of an old tree. His posture was heavy with resignation, yet his eyes had dulled only enough to maintain a convincing illusion. Beneath that veneer, he waited. Calculating. Let's test that, shall we? The figure continued. It crouched just enough to pluck from the ground a broken branch, a splintered weapon, thick in girth, one end pointed into a jagged spear by nature's careless carving. Without hesitation, and with the kind of calm that made the act far more chilling, it drove the branch deep into Lucas's left shoulder. The impact was a brutal symphony of sensations, the sharp crack as wood met bone, the wet sound of tearing flesh, and the metallic tang of pain flooding Lucas's senses. Fire seemed to crawl through his veins, burning like molten wire beneath the skin. Every instinct screamed for him to retaliate, to rip the weapon free and strike back, but he kept absolutely still. This was not his moment. Not yet. A dark stain of blood began its slow journey down his arm, soaking into the dirt at his side. The figure bent closer, its voice was devoid of cruelty yet tinged with genuine curiosity, as though studying some rare specimen. So the wolfsbane has worked, it murmured. Then why can't I see any fear in your eyes? Lucas's lips twitched upward into the faintest smile, forcing a rasp into his voice. That's easy, he said. I'm not afraid of you. The thing laughed, an unnatural sound that echoed wrong in the air, resonating from somewhere deeper than the lungs of the body it wore. It was a laugh that felt stolen, distorted, as if filtered through layers of something primal and predatory. See, it said, amused without warmth, that's the quality I admire in humans. Even broken, they find new ways to be surprising. It lowered itself to a crouch, bringing its gaze level with Lucas's. You already know I'm not the man standing before you, it said with a faint glimmer of appreciation. So let's not pretend. It has been a long time since I've spoken as myself, not hidden behind a human facade, not as a host, but as what I truly am. Lucas tilted his head, the corners of his mouth curling. Why not? He said lightly. It's not as if I have anywhere else to be. His grin took on a teasing edge. Do you have a name? The figure straightened slightly, almost pleased by the civility of it. Not really, it admitted. I've always borrowed the names of those of inhabited. Lucas gave a soft, thoughtful hum, his eyes catching the faintest glint. What about Tony? That seems like a nice name. The figure paused, considering, and then allowed a genuine smile to creep across its face. Tony, it repeated slowly, tasting the sound. I like it. From this moment forward, you may call me Tony. Good, Lucas said. Now that we're acquainted, his tone shifted, suddenly razor sharp. In an explosion of motion, Lucas struck. His speed was the kind born of instinct and honed by experience, faster than thought, sharper than hesitation. His right arm lashed out, and claws flashed into existence mid-strike, slicing through the thin space between them before burying themselves deep into Tony's chest. The parasite responded in panic, a hideous jolt of wrongness radiating from within the stolen body, but Lucas had already begun tearing it apart. His claws pierced deeper, past bone and tissue, until his hand wrapped around something that pulsed and writhed, an alien vine-like organism entwined along the length of the spine. With a violent wrench, he tore it free. The scream that followed was not bound to human anatomy. It vibrated through the host's nerves, an unholy chorus carried by every fiber of the stolen body. Lucas did not flinch. With deliberate brutality, he crushed the parasite between his fingers, slicing its tendrils into severed husks. Lightning surged from his claws, flooding into it until the last echo of the scream was extinguished. The human shell crumpled lifelessly to the forest floor, empty at last. Straightening slowly, Lucas's breath came steady despite the blood dripping from his shoulder. He looked down at what was left, both man and parasite. "Goodbye, Tony," he said quietly. Then he turned and walked away, leaving the forest to swallow the silence once more. Chapter 129. Shadows lifted, smoke remains. Lucas's perspective. By the time Lucas made his way back through the winding path to the Lockwood estate, the ache in his shoulder had vanished entirely, as though it had never existed. Where only minutes earlier there had been torn flesh and searing pain, there was now smooth skin and a faint shimmer beneath the light. The puncture wound had sealed itself long before the gravel under his boots stopped crunching, leaving behind no trace of the injury except a lingering memory that his body refused to keep. He stepped inside the grand, silent mansion. The air was cold, still carrying the chill of early morning. In the gilded washroom mirror, Lucas caught a brief reflection of himself, little pale, weary-eyed, streaked with dirt and blood that wasn't entirely his. He ran the tap until the water turned warm and watched crimson spirals fade down the drain, washing away the evidence of the death he left behind in the woods. Beneath his skin, he felt it, the remnants of the foreign and unnatural presence, fading away, like a shadow drawing back into the dark. A reminder that even victories in Beacon Hills never came clean. Hours later, when the sun had fully taken hold of the sky, the three of them gathered in Isaac's living room. The atmosphere was dim and heavy, shaped by unspoken thoughts. The curtains were drawn tight, keeping the sun out, or perhaps, trying to keep something else from slipping in. Malia leaned against the far wall with her arms folded, her expression unreadable but her posture tense. Isaac sat on the couch, his restlessness bleeding through in the way he twirled a pencil between his fingers, fast, then slow, then fast again. Lucas stood near the window, his silhouette outlined by the light. His eyes stared past the glass, into the distance, as if searching for something he knew he wouldn't find. When he finally turned to face them, he didn't waste time. No dramatic build-up, no lingering suspense. Just the truth. He told them everything. The mysterious figure, the shadowy force that had been pulling strings from the dark, setting hunters and wolves against each other, wasn't a person at all. Not anymore. It had never been just a man. What they'd been chasing, fighting, fearing, was a parasite. Ancient. Sentient. A thing that latched onto the dead and wore them like suits of flesh. The man they thought they were fighting had died long before any of them ever laid eyes on him. What remained was a shell animated by something far worse, something cunning, hollow, and patient. A predator with no face of its own, content to use others as tools in its long, slow game. When he finished, silence stretched across the room like static caught between lightning strikes. The only sound was Isaac's pencil, faintly tapping his knee before falling from his hand. Isaac broke the stillness first. So, it wasn't a person at all. Lucas shook his head slowly. No. Just a parasite pretending to be one. Isaac's brow furrowed as he tried to wrap his head around it. But why? Why go through all that? Turning people on each other, igniting old blood feuds between the Hales and the Argents, it even killed 3 hunters just to keep the conflict going. Lucas let out a long breath as he sank into the armchair, suddenly feeling the weight of everything he'd just said. He rubbed the back of his neck, eyes closing briefly. I don't know, Isaac. This isn't some TV drama where the bad guy pauses in the middle of a tense situation to monologue about his tragic backstory and master plan. He let his head rest against the cushion, voice a little quieter. Whatever its reasons were, it's gone now. And that's what matters. The game it was playing. It's over. Across the room, Malia let out a breath through her nose, part sigh, part release of tension. Good, she said, her voice edged with fatigue and something darker, anger, maybe. That parasitic bastard did nothing but try to ruin our lives. Manipulating people, making us fight each other. I say we stop wasting our time trying to understand it and start thinking about what comes next. She looked between the two of them, her gaze sharp. The Argents aren't going to back off. Not after this. If they think we're a threat, they'll come for Isaac, and the rest of us too. Lucas nodded slowly, his eyes still distant but focused now with purpose. And when they do, we can't afford to be caught off guard. No one spoke after that. The silence that followed wasn't tense, but it wasn't calm either. It was the silence that settles in after a long battle has ended, but before the next one begins. Outside, the wind began to shift, and in that sound there was a premonition that this day, though still, was only an intermission before the next act began. Chapter 130 The Remains. The forest was silent except for the hum of insects and the crunch of boots on pine needles. Chris Argent stood before the corpse illuminated by the harsh white beams of flashlights. The man's body lay crumpled against a tree, chest hollowed, spine torn open like a page ripped out of a book. It wasn't the savagery that unsettled Chris, he'd seen far worse in his life, it was the precision. No sloppy claw marks. Tearing consistent with a werewolf kill. Just a surgical split, deliberate and clean, as if something had burrowed in and carved its way out. He crouched beside the corpse, gloves creaking as he examined the wound. This wasn't an animal, he muttered. And it wasn't rage. Whoever, or whatever, did this knew exactly what they were doing. Behind him, Edward, one of his senior hunters, crossed his arms, jaw set tight. You're overthinking it, Chris. Hail territory. Hail handiwork. They've gotten bold since that boy Isaac started running with them. Chris straightened and fixed him with a cool, measured stare. You've been in this line of work long enough to know when something doesn't fit. There's no wolf residue, no similar claw drag. This doesn't look like one of them. Edward scoffed. And yet the body's in their woods. Where else would you find a monster? Chris didn't answer immediately. His eyes drifted toward the deeper trees, the darkness where sound seemed to die. Something about this kill reeked of design, not impulse. And design meant intelligence. Pull back the team, Chris finally said. We'll collect samples and run a full analysis. Edward stepped forward, bristling. So what? We wait while the Hales regroup. While those kids kill more of our people. Chris's tone hardened. We don't make assumptions that get more of our people killed. Edward met his gaze, defiance simmering beneath restraint. You're losing your edge, Chris. Gerard would have burned this whole forest by now. Chris's eyes flashed with something sharp, dangerous. Gerard's old ways costed us too much. Don't mistake restraint for weakness. The two men stood locked in silent opposition, the rest of the hunters uneasy around them. The forest seemed to lean in, listening. Finally, Chris broke the standoff. Bag the body. Quietly. I'll handle the report. Edward hesitated, then gave a stiff nod before barking orders to the others. Chris watched as they lifted the corpse onto the stretcher, the spine wound gaping like an unanswered question. As the team moved out, Chris lingered a moment longer. He looked back toward the trees, at the faint trail of crushed leaves and disturbed soil leading nowhere. Something was wrong in Beacon Hills, something that didn't belong to wolves or hunters. And for the first time in a long while, Chris Argent wasn't sure which side of the line he was really standing on. Lucas's perspective. The forest still smelled of blood and ozone when Lucas returned. Damp leaves whispered underfoot, the early morning sun glinting off broken bark and scorched soil. This was where he had killed the puppet yesterday, where the parasite had died. But now the place was wrong, after the Argents left. The scent trail left behind was faint but mostly undisturbed, heavy footprints, metallic tang of hunter gear, gun oil, and a little wolfsbane residue from the Argents. Yet the air was off, stripped clean. The hunters had come and taken the body. Lucas crouched where the man's corpse had fallen. His eyes shifted, pupils narrowing as he inhaled the story buried in the soil. The smell of decay was missing, replaced by antiseptic and a trace of familiar musk, pine soap, latex, faint cologne. Deaton, Lucas muttered. He stood, brushed the dirt off his hands, and started walking toward town. The bell above the clinic door jingled faintly as Lucas entered. The place smelled of alcohol wipes, hay, and faint magic, the quiet, humming kind Deaton always kept on hand. Deaton stood over a steel table at the back, examining something under the glow of a surgical lamp. The faint tendrils of the parasite, what was left of them, floated in a petri dish like threads of rotted ivy. Lucas's reflection appeared beside Deaton's in the glass. You found it before the Argents did. Deaton didn't flinch. He kept his eyes on the sample, his voice even. I had to. If they'd arrived first, they would have taken this without understanding what it really is. Lucas stepped closer, studying the remains. You think this thing can be useful? I don't think, Deaton said quietly. I know. He picked up a pair of tweezers, turning one shredded vine under the light. This organism was capable of interfacing directly with the nervous system. It hijacked a host's brainstem, feeding off their rage and pain, amplifying it. Imagine what happens when that energy moves through wolves and hunters already primed for violence. War, Lucas said flatly. Deaton nodded. A war carefully arranged by something that didn't care who won. Lucas folded his arms, gaze cold. How did you even find the site? Laura, Deaton answered, setting the tweezers down. Malia told her what happened. Laura called me. Derek and I followed the scent and found the body before the Argents. I brought what I could hear, enough to study, to understand. Lucas studied the remains, what was once, Tony. He thought about the vine crawling along a man's spine, wearing a human face like a glove. Can you prove it? Deaton met his eyes. Not yet. But if I can isolate whatever chemical this parasite used to manipulate its hosts, it'll be something tangible, evidence both sides can't ignore. Lucas exhaled slowly, the weight of the wood still in his bones. Then we'd better hope you find it before someone on the hunter's side runs out of patience. Deaton's gaze drifted back to the sample under the light, its withered tendrils glistening faintly under the light. Chapter 131. The Truth Beneath the Skin. The morgue felt as if it had been carved out of silence. Fluorescent tubes hummed with a mechanical indifference, their dull light laying pale grids across the linoleum floor. In the corner, a faint rustle, the scratch of paper against metal, broke the stillness like a mouse in a cathedral. Chris Argent stood with his hands on the edge of a stainless steel table, shoulders tight, eyes locked on the open report that had been placed before him. The formal language on the page should have been a comfort, neat sentences, clinical phrasing, but the words themselves carried a chill. Unknown organic compound detected in spinal fluid, composition non-biological yet cellularly active. The sentence sat in the center of the page like an accusation. It had the sudden, searing clarity of a revelation that refuses to be unlearned. Chris read it once, twice, as if repetition might somehow demystify it. It only deepened the strangeness. He'd been doing this, hunting, tracking, cleaning up the things ordinary people were never supposed to see, for most of his adult life. He knew the anatomy of threat, the telltale sense of shapeshifters, the crooked signatures left by creatures that thought themselves clever, the runes and remnants of old magic. He had faced monsters that showed teeth and monsters that wore smiles, things convened by moonlight and things conscripted by blood. But this report did not belong in any file labeled familiar. This was not animalistic hunger of the corrupted or druidic influence. This was something else entirely, something that didn't belong. The coroner, a man with tired eyes and the look of someone who'd learned to keep unpleasant confidences, cleared his throat. He'd done Chris a few favors over the years, tonight he offered another. Whatever it wasn't part of the body originally, the coroner said, voice low enough that the machines and tiles might not pick it up. The spinal cord, it's almost rewired. Like it's been adapted to act as an interface. Cellular structures where there shouldn't be any. Something built to plug in. That line, built to plug in, twisted something in Chris's chest. He didn't speak. He just stared at the photo clipped to the file, a jagged tear running down the corpse's back, flesh ripped open to expose a hollow cavity where the spine should have been connected. The precision of it unsettled him. Not rage. Not hunger. Purpose. He let his fingers trace the edge of the photograph as if the paper could tell him more. The image reflected back a pale, dead face with empty, glassy eyes, but it was the wound, the absence and the precision, that haunted him. Whatever had made it had done so with intent and knowledge. That thought made his mouth dry. Thanks, Chris said at last, closing the folder with care. Should I forward the report to? No, Chris interrupted, his tone final. This stays between us. He had seen too many things escalate because someone could not stomach unknowns. The hunter's code had teeth for a reason, but it also had judgment, and experience had taught him when to hold fire. The coroner's eyebrows rose. If it's related to those killings, it's connected to something worse, Chris cut in, slipping the folder into his jacket pocket. He felt the weight of the paper like the weight of a decision. He had to pick his battles. He stepped out into the morning that tasted of cold and burn. The town had not yet shaken sleep from its shoulders. The air felt almost conspiratorial, as if it, too, anticipated the trouble that had dug its fingers into Beacon Hills. His people had already started to whisper, about vengeance, about retaliation. Edward especially was pushing for blood, demanding that they strike before the Hales could. But this didn't fit the story. This wound, this unnatural fusing into bone and tissue, didn't fit any of the usual profiles. The Hales were brutal when they needed to be, Their savagery carried the jagged randomness of an animal out for vengeance. This worked with tools and intelligence. It used anatomy like a machine uses a socket. It had a purpose beyond killing. He walked to his car, the engine already warm, and sat with the folder on his lap. He opened it again, habit making him read the lines as if they might rearrange into something softer, something more comprehensible. His mind supplied answers it did not trust. A new type of corrupted weaponized parasite, a alchemically manufactured organism, old rituals slipped into flesh. The possibilities stacked and collapsed like cards. Something had used the dead man, like a weapon, or worse, a disguise. He exhaled slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. What the hell are we dealing with? He muttered. He could already feel the fracture widening. His people wanted action, not answers. But if he told them the truth too soon, they'd see it as weakness. If he told them nothing, they'd start a war. So he chose a third path, silence. He would investigate quietly, alone, until he knew what this thing really was. And when he did, maybe, just maybe, he could stop the next body from hitting the ground. Chris shifted the car into gear and drove off, the report lying open on the passenger seat. The paper rustled slightly with the motion, and a single photo slid free, the dead man's vacant eyes staring up at him through the dim light. Whatever this thing was, it had already found a way into Beacon Hills. And Chris Argent intended to tear it out, root and spine. Chapter 132, The Thing Beneath the Soil. The woods held their breath, heavy and hushed beneath the weight of late afternoon. The golden light slanted through thinning tree canopies, casting long shadows that stretched like fingers across the forest floor. Every now and then, the wind stirred, a soft, searching breath that rustled through the half-dead leaves still clinging to the branches. The air was thick with the scent of approaching rain, mingled with the sour musk of rot and the earthy perfume of decaying foliage. Darren Cole, a maintenance worker for the county, let out a grunt as he drove the blade of his shovel into the damp, forgiving ground. Sweat clung to the back of his neck despite the cooling air, and every movement sent a dull ache through his lower back. He'd been sent out here to clear debris along the old access road, the one no one really liked talking about anymore. It wound past the edge of the preserve, near where that car went off the road just a week ago. Official reports had blamed the crash on animal attack. Unofficially, people whispered about something else. His coworkers called this stretch of forest cursed. Said things lived out here, things that shouldn't. Darren didn't believe in that kind of talk. He believed in time and a half and job security. The real curse, as far as he was concerned, was that he was working late on a Friday. He spat into the dirt and wiped the sweat from his brow with the back of a gloved hand. Town's full of stories, he muttered, prying a stubborn root from the ground. Full of bored people with nothing better to do. The blade hit something with a dull thunk, not the sharp resistance of stone, not the hollow clatter of metal. It was softer. Yielding, almost. Frowning, Darren crouched and began sweeping away the loose soil with methodical brushes of his hand. The dirt crumbled away easily, revealing something strange beneath it, something smooth and faintly glistening. It caught the fading light, but not in the way of glass or metal. It was organic. Wet. He made a face. Great, he mumbled. Another raccoon carcass. Maybe a possum this time. But it wasn't. The thing twitched. He froze, instincts prickling. For a moment, he couldn't quite process what he was seeing. A slender, wet tendril no wider than a worm slowly uncoiled from the earth, slick and glistening like it had just emerged from deep underground. Darren's first thought was that it was a root, maybe one glistening from rainwater. But roots didn't move like that. And then it moved again, deliberately, unnervingly, twisting toward him. What the hell? Before he could scramble back, the thing snapped upward, fast, impossibly fast, and latched onto the side of his neck. Darren cried out in pain and shock, stumbling back, clawing at his skin with both hands. But it was too late. The tendril was already writhing beneath his fingers, slick and strong, burrowing with terrifying precision. He felt it slide under his skin, a sensation so alien and intimate it made him gag. It threaded through his flesh like a needle through cloth, worming deeper, moving with purpose. Like it was searching for something. Like it knew exactly where to go. His shovel clattered to the ground. Darren collapsed to his knees, his breaths coming fast and shallow. His eyes bulged, wild with panic, as the thing beneath his skin began to pulse, slow and steady, just under the surface of his throat. For one brief, blinding moment, the pain sharpened, flared white-hot. And then, silence, stillness, relief. His breathing slowed. His muscles relaxed. The woods were quiet again. The wind had gone. Darren rose slowly to his feet, his movements strangely smooth, almost practiced. The ragged puncture wound at the base of his neck had already closed, leaving behind only a faint, seamless mark, as if nothing had ever broken the skin. He turned his head, surveying the trees around him with unsettling calm, his eyes flicking from shadow to shadow like he was searching for something unseen. Or perhaps, listening. Then he smiled. But it wasn't his smile. Without a word, he reached down and retrieved the shovel, shaking the dirt from its blade. He stood straighter than before, posture crisp and unnatural, as though some invisible string now guided his limbs. He did not head toward the truck. He did not walk back toward the road or the clearing where he'd parked. He turned and began to walk deeper into the woods. The sun dipped below the horizon, bleeding its last golden light into the trees. The air grew colder. Shadows thickened. Behind him, the soil where he had knelt stirred faintly, disturbed by a whisper of the wind. And then, as quickly as it had come, nothing. Chapter 133. The Memory of Flesh. The body that had once belonged to a man named Darren shuddered violently, as if gasping in the cold breath of a second birth. A rasping inhalation filled the stale air of the apartment as the parasite completed its grotesque work, threading itself into his spinal cord, fusing nerve to nerve, root to root, until there was no longer a boundary between host and invader, just one breathing, twitching hole. For a brief, suspended moment, the room was silent. The only sounds were the hum of an old refrigerator vibrating faintly in the kitchen, the dull electrical buzz of a street lamp outside the half-cracked window, and the slow, uncertain beat of a heart that did not yet know to be afraid. Then his eyes opened. They were Darren's eyes, same irises, same blood vessels mapped like rivers in the whites, but they no longer saw the world the way he had. The pupils expanded unnaturally, blooming like ink in water. What peered through them was no longer the soul of a man. The thing inside smiled. Its first movements were unsteady. Muscles trembled under the unfamiliar weight of flesh. Ligaments strained. The lungs drew in air again, tentative, experimental. The tongue flexed against the roof of the mouth, tasting the dust in the air. Hands, Darren's hands, rubbed slowly against each other, fingertips brushing against skin that still felt strange, as though the body belonged to someone else. It did. Better, the creature whispered. The voice that emerged was Darren's, but weathered now by something older, coarser, darker, touched by an echo of rotten ruin. Serviceable, at least. He staggered at first, but quickly taking even steps across the apartment, moving through a life not his own. The framed photographs on the wall showed Darren smiling beside friends on fishing trips, laughing with people the parasite didn't know. There were stacks of unopened mail on the counter, a familiar scent lingering in the air, laundry detergent mixed with the sting of cheap whiskey and the faintest trace of loneliness. And then, the flood. Memories surfaced like bodies in a thawing lake. They weren't sought, they were taken. The parasite dipped into the nervous system, threading through synapses and bioelectric whispers, devouring the fragments left behind. It drank deeply. Flashes of forgotten birthdays and bitter arguments, drunken nights and unpaid debts, kisses in parking lots and breakups on doorsteps. Laughter. Rage. Regret. The full, unremarkable weight of Darren's small life was laid bare, and absorbed. He had been ordinary. And that made him perfect. Tony, the name the parasite had earned, eased onto the sagging couch, letting the body sink into the cushions. He closed Darren's eyes, but he wasn't resting. Deep within, he navigated the web of foreign neurons, adjusting, recalibrating, until the form no longer felt foreign. Until it was his. Then he went deeper still, beneath Darren's life, past the layer of stolen memories, and pulled open the vault of his own. It was not a place, but a sensation, hot, jagged, half-buried. He remembered the darkness, the scent of blood, the chorus of flashlights slicing through fog and trees like beams through smoke. 6 years ago. The iron stink of blood mixed with the sharp bitterness of wolfsbane. The howls. The fire. Talia Hale and her pack, fierce, righteous, united in purpose. And Gerard Argent's hunters, disciplined, ruthless, their conviction as sharp as their silver. Two factions joined by necessity, fighting side by side for the first and only time. They had come together to end him. He remembered it all. He remembered the chaos he'd sown, how wolves and hunters had turned on each other with claws and blades, fury and fear feeding into a cyclone of violence he had orchestrated like a symphony. He remembered the taste of their rage, metallic, intoxicating, beautiful. And then, her. Talia. Even in death, she had been something glorious. Fire in her blood, resolve etched into every movement. Her claws glowing blue with mountain ash, searing his flesh, reducing half his body to rotten smoke. She had screamed something at him, a warning, a curse, he couldn't remember, as she tore through him. He had unraveled that night. Pieces of him had burned, pieces had withered. But even as his body dissolved under her final strike, something deeper, older, had responded. Some primal instinct. Something that would not allow him to end. As the edges of consciousness darkened, he had torn a sliver from himself, not a memory, but a seed. A piece small enough to escape, to bury itself in the soil, hidden within marrow and mold. A promise sealed in decay. 6 years. For 6 long years, he waited, plodding in the dark, seeking a vessel that could hold him. Only once he had found one did he return to Beacon Hills, hungry for revenge. But he was stopped once again, this time by a werewolf named Lucas, not Talia. And when Darren, lonely and unremarkable Darren, had wandered too close, it had acted. The parasite smiled wider, the grin cutting a little too deep into Darren's cheeks. He opened his eyes again and surveyed the apartment, his now, fully. He rose and walked to the mirror mounted above the small dresser. The reflection that stared back was unassuming, a man in his 30s, tired, worn by life but not broken. Perfect camouflage. No one would look at Darren and see the monster inside. Tony touched the glass. I told you, Talia, he whispered to the silence, you can't kill what refuses to die. He stepped back from the mirror and turned toward the door. But as his hand reached for the knob, his thoughts shifted, not to Talia, not to Gerard, but to another. Lucas. The boy with the eyes like hers. The power like hers. Tony had come back to Beacon Hills to finish what had begun. To collect the debts owed to him in blood. But Lucas, the unexpected variable, had stopped him. Somehow. Where Talia had used fire, Lucas had used instinct, speed, cunning. He had been something new. Tony had almost underestimated him. Almost. But even then, something inside, some gut-deep alarm, had screamed danger every time Lucas stepped into view. So Tony had prepared. He had left a seed behind, tucked away in soil and dirt before going after the boy. Insurance. If he hadn't, he might not be standing here now. And now, thanks to that foresight, thanks to the plan buried within the instinct to survive, he had returned again, through Darren. He was back. He stood at the threshold of the apartment, flexing fingers that were no longer wholly human, the bones beneath shaped by something far older, far hungrier. His smile returned, sharper now, predatory. There are debts to collect, he muttered, voice laced with venom and anticipation. The Hales. The Argents. And the boy. Lucas. Tony licked his lips, savoring the name like it was a flavor. This time, he whispered to the night, I'll make sure you beg before the end. And with that, he stepped out into the cool darkness of Beacon Hills, reborn in flesh, carrying memories like weapons, and bringing with him a storm 6 years in the making. Chapter 134, The Hollow Man. Tony sat utterly still on the worn couch after returning to the apartment, the faded fabric sagging beneath Darren's borrowed weight. The space around him was small and unremarkable, just like its former occupant, a forgettable slice of Beacon Hills, tucked into an aging building where neighbors barely exchanged names. The only sound was the low, monotonous hum of the refrigerator in the corner, its motor vibrating through the thin kitchen wall. It was the kind of background noise that most people stopped noticing after a while, but not Tony. Not now. His chest rose and fell with shallow, mechanical breaths, his new lungs functioning out of instinct rather than need. There was no real urgency to the movement, no true necessity behind it. It was a reflex of the flesh, this human vessel he now inhabited, as pointless as it was disquieting. Slowly, deliberately, he flexed his fingers. Each movement sent unfamiliar signals through nerve endings he hadn't earned, synapses firing in strange patterns. The hands were too soft. The muscles beneath them weak, untrained. A body built for mediocrity, not domination. Not survival. When he touched his wrist, he could feel the pulse fluttering beneath the skin, fast, erratic. It beat with the fragile insistence of mortal life, and the sensation turned his stomach. Disgusting. For centuries, he had known power in its most intoxicating forms, a silent architect of chaos, threading whispers into the minds of monsters and men alike. He had slipped inside thoughts like water, bending wills until they snapped, igniting wars between shapeshifters, hunters, and innocents. They never saw the strings. They never realized they were dancing for him. Every moment had been a calculated stroke of manipulation. Every outcome, his design. But that was before. Now, he was trapped in something that bled. Something that tired. Something that could fall apart with a single well-aimed blow. A body that had been neglected by its owner, and desperate enough for Tony to slide in unnoticed. And yet, there was a silver lining. No one would see this coming. His eyes closed, and he turned inward, reaching for the place where his power once thrived. The chorus of voices he had always heard in the back of his mind, overlapping thoughts, raw emotion, fractured memories, all ripe for plucking and twisting. But this time, nothing answered. No connection. No distant thoughts or flickers of rage to hold onto. Just an awful, suffocating quiet. His tether was gone. Tony exhaled sharply, not in frustration, but in cold, clinical acceptance. He could no longer feed on fear, nor amplify hate. He could no longer pull the strings of his puppets from a distance. No more hallucinations, no more twisting memories, no more invisible fingers tugging at the edges of sanity. But even as that realization sank in, a crooked smile found its way to his borrowed mouth. So, he muttered, tasting the words, testing how they felt coming from Darren's throat. Back to square one, just like 6 years ago. He let the words sit there for a moment, suspended in the stale air. Pathetic, he added with a quiet scoff. But useful. Leaning back against the cushion, he stared up at the ceiling. Cracks spider-webbed across the plaster like faded scars, neglected and forgotten, much like this place, much like this body. But Tony's mind was already working, ticking methodically, cold and precise. Lucas. That name cut through the haze like a knife. A boy born of defiance. Unmarked by darkness. Unspoiled by anger or frustration. Lucas had been a fluke, an anomaly, and in that anomaly, the raw, untamed potential Tony had been chasing across lifetimes. That spark within him, that lighting. It was something else. Something rare. And more importantly, it was powerful. Perfect vessel, Tony murmured. Lucas had ended him. Or so he'd thought. Tony's parasite form had been shattered, broken apart by Lucas's power. Reduced to a shadow of its former self. He had barely managed to cling to existence thanks to the seed, slipping into Darren's body like a drowning man reaching for driftwood. Now, he lived in scraps, emotions instead of power, survival instead of dominance. But it was enough. Just enough to begin again. Tony rose from the couch, his movements stiff but steady. He paced the narrow living room, the floorboards creaking beneath his bare feet. The Hales would be on edge now. The Argents are still hunting. Grief and vengeance made excellent blindfolds. A war between them would make the perfect smoke screen. All he had to do was nudge the pieces, slowly. His laugh came low and quiet, not the feral sound of a beast drunk on blood, but something far more dangerous. A whisper of patience, of calculation, of certainty. No more claws. No brute force. Just the right words, spoken at the right time. That's all it takes to tip a world over. He moved to the window, pulling aside the thin curtain. Outside, Beacon Hill slumbered under a cloudy night sky. Streetlights blinked. A car rumbled down the road. Ordinary. Peaceful. And completely unaware of what was coming. Tony stared at his own reflection, faint in the glass, Darren's face, yes, but hollowed, emptied of self. A mannequin animated by purpose. I'll make you break yourself, Lucas, he whispered, his reflection faint in the glass. And when you do, I'll be there to take what's left. He let the curtain fall. Tony turned away from the window, Darren's face settling into an expression that belonged to no one, a hollow shell wearing humanity like a mask. Then he smiled. Round 2. Chapter 135, A Fragile Truce. The bell above the door of the Beacon Hills Animal Clinic gave a faint chime, its sound almost too delicate to herald the weight Chris Argent carried with him as he crossed the threshold. The familiar antiseptic tang of disinfectant filled his nostrils, mingling with the quiet hum of medical equipment in the sterile air. It was calm here, unnervingly so. Too calm, perhaps, for a man who had spent the past 7 days neck-deep in bloodshed and funerals, surrounded by grief, confusion. Behind the front counter, Deaton looked up the counter, brow furrowed slightly in surprise, but not alarm. His composure, as always, was measured. Calculated. He didn't flinch, not even when his eyes met Chris's. Mr. Argent, Deaton greeted, his tone cool but courteous. He reached for a towel and began wiping his hands. I can't say I expected to see you here. What brings you to my door? Chris didn't waste time with pleasantries. From the inside pocket of his dark jacket, he drew out a folded document, already creased, smudged, and clearly well-read. He held it out as he stepped closer. It's the autopsy report on the John Doe found a few days ago in the forest, near the state line, he said. The one that didn't fit any known profiles, human or otherwise. His voice was low, guarded. There's a detail in the toxicology that doesn't make sense. A foreign organic compound was found in the spinal fluid, Something synthetic, but not man-made. Lab techs can't identify it. It's not natural. Deaton took the paper, his expression unreadable as he scanned the top lines. A flicker of interest passed through his eyes, but he said nothing immediately. I thought, Chris continued, that if anyone in Beacon Hills might recognize what we're dealing with, it would be you. There was a pause. Not one of hesitation, but of quiet judgment. You realize what you're asking, Deaton said as he turned toward the corridor leading to the clinic's restricted back rooms. You're coming to me with this, knowing my history with the Hales. Knowing what it might look like. Chris followed without argument. I know your ties to the Hales, he said plainly. But you're also the closest thing Beacon Hills has to a scientist who understands the supernatural. Deaton gave a nod, subtle, reluctant perhaps, and pushed open the door to the back lab. The room beyond was dimly lit, colder, and lined with stainless steel surfaces that gleamed under the soft white of surgical lights. At the far end, a containment drawer hissed softly as Deaton unlocked and opened it, retrieving a sealed tray from within. He set it gently on the metal table between them, then released the locks on the lid. Inside the tray lay something withered and grotesque, a shriveled, sinewy remnant of some creature long dead. It looked almost like a bundle of blackened vines or roots, charred at the ends. Even under the sterile lighting, it seemed to twitch, or perhaps that was just the trick of the light playing against its strange texture. Chris's jaw clenched. His voice dropped an octave. What in God's name is that? Deaton didn't answer right away. His eyes lingered on the specimen, not in fear, but in weary recognition. What's left of something very old, he said at last, his voice hushed with both respect and unease. It's a parasitic organism. Not human, not animal. Something entirely other. It burrowed into a host, a werewolf, and hijacked the nervous system. Overrode instincts. Controlled behavior. It's what caused the recent killings, and why they seemed so off, unlike anything we've seen before. The violence wasn't random. It was orchestrated. Chris stared at the parasite, then back at Deaton. His mind flashed through images he hadn't been able to shake for days, the brutal attacks, the senseless deaths, the bodies of hunters. And now, this thing. This thing had been pulling the strings. You're saying it manipulated both sides. That this creature made us enemies. I believe it exacerbated tensions that were already there, Deaton said. It didn't create hatred, but it fed on it, inflamed it. Pushed it past the breaking point. Chris's fingers curled into fists at his sides. Can you prove it? Not definitively. Not yet, Deaton admitted. But I'm running tissue analysis now. If I can isolate the compounds it uses to hijack neurological pathways, if I can demonstrate how it rewired the brain to heighten aggression, then yes, maybe. Maybe I can show this wasn't just war. It was infection. Chris let out a long, heavy breath. If you can prove that, if you can show what really happened, I might be able to stop what's coming next, Deaton finished for him. Chris nodded slowly, absorbing the implications. His posture softened, barely, but something in his eyes shifted. It wasn't trust. Not yet. But it was understanding. Recognition of a shared burden. You'll have my support, Doctor, he said. Quietly. I'll tell my hunters to steer clear of this place for now. But they're on edge. Some of them won't listen. They've buried too many of their own. If they catch wind that you're working with the Hales again, it'll unravel everything, Deaton said, nodding. I know the risks. And you're still willing to take them. If we don't, then this whole town might tear itself apart. There was a long silence between them, filled with the unspoken weight of too many dead and too many mistakes. Chris turned toward the door. Then we keep it in the dark, he said. Just like the thing that started this. As he stepped back into the front of the clinic, the bell above the door chimed again. Sunlight spilled across the tiled floor, too bright for the mood hanging around his shoulders. His phone buzzed in his pocket, multiple times in rapid succession. A cluster of messages from his hunters. Demanding updates. Demanding answers. Demanding vengeance. He stared at the screen for a moment before slipping it away, unread. They'll get answers, he murmured under his breath. Just not the ones they're expecting. Chapter 136, Quiet Shadows. Morning light unfurled across Beacon Hills in ribbons of gold, soft and deceptive in its beauty. It washed over rooftops still damp with dew, spilled through the skeletal branches of old oaks, and crept into every corner as if to reassure the town that everything was fine, that the past few weeks of chaos and blood had only been a fever dream. The illusion of calm was convincing enough that Lucas almost believed it. For the first time in what felt like weeks, he breathed without tasting tension or smoke in his lungs. The air didn't hum with danger. It didn't smell like fear or secrets. It was just air, clean, bright, ordinary. He jogged through the quiet streets, shoes tapping a steady rhythm on the pavement, and felt that rare stillness settle inside his chest, the kind of silence that only follows catastrophe, fragile and fleeting. Malia was with Laura and Derek, trying to piece together their own version of peace. Isaac was probably still buried under blankets, enjoying a long overdue morning without alarms or monsters. Deaton, as always, was lost in his work, dissecting mysteries in his clinic until they gave up their truths. That left Lucas alone. Running. Existing. Almost human. He moved past the familiar landmarks of Beacon Hills, the town square, the rusted clock tower that hadn't chimed in years, the cafe with the chipped blue awning where locals swapped gossip over bitter coffee. A Togo cup warmed his hand, the steam curling into the cool morning air. His gaze was light for once, his senses half-closed, the world around him soft-edged and harmless. He'd earned a few hours of pretending the world wasn't always on the verge of burning. But calm, in Beacon Hills, was always a prelude. And somewhere within that same square, blending effortlessly into the tide of ordinary faces, Darren watched. Tony's new vessel still felt foreign, like a suit that didn't quite fit. Human hearts were fragile things, always quivering, always betraying their panic with too loud beats. This one thudded too quickly, the rhythm erratic whenever the parasite inside it remembered rage. Sweat gathered uninvited, nerves misfired, vision blurred when emotions surged too sharply. Human flesh, such a delicate, temperamental casing. But it worked. It hid him. He'd cut the hair shorter, erased the unshaven scruff Darren used to favor, and traded worn clothes for ones that looked convincingly new. From a distance, he was indistinguishable from a dozen others passing through the square, a man with errands to run, maybe hungover, maybe late for work, staring into his phone like it held meaning. A perfect ghost wrapped in skin. And beneath that mask, Tony watched. His eyes tracked Lucas's every movement with surgical precision, like an artist studying the lines of a masterpiece he intended to steal. The posture, loose but centered. The way his gaze skimmed the crowd without ever settling, always aware, always assessing. Even from meters away, Tony could sense the faint shimmer of energy under Lucas's skin, power restrained, coiled, alive. That pulse called to him like a heartbeat under floorboards. He didn't just want that vessel, he needed it. But the parasite had learned patience the hard way. He remembered the fire, the night 6 years ago when everything went wrong. Talia's claws raking through his flesh. Gerard's blade sinking into the body he wore then, splitting bone and arrogance in equal measure. The again with Lucas, he remembered dying, or something close enough to it, and the long, endless crawl back to existence. That memory had burned the lesson deep. No more recklessness. This time, he would move quietly. Carefully. Human. Lucas sat on a bench near the edge of the square, stretching his arms as sunlight spilled over him like blessing. His head tilted back, eyes half closed, letting the warmth touch his face. For a moment, the picture was almost convincing, a man at peace, unburdened, ordinary. He had no idea that 50 meters away, the shadow he thought he'd destroyed now wore another man's skin and smiled like he'd never left. Tony sipped his coffee, the cheap bitterness grounding him in the moment. He smiled faintly, not at irony, but at symmetry. Hunter and prey. Werewolf and parasite. Peace, and the quiet thing that grows beneath it. Lucas believed he'd finally killed the shadow that haunted Beacon Hills. But the shadow had adapted. It had learned to breathe again. To walk unseen. To wait. And when Lucas finally rose from the bench, tossing his empty cup into a bin and stretching lazily, Tony pocketed his phone and followed, just another man in a crowd that never looked twice. His steps matched the rhythm of the town's heartbeat, slow, deliberate, invisible. The morning air was calm, bright, almost sacred. That's what made it perfect. Chapter 137, Fracture in the Ranks. The Argent safe house was steeped in shadows, its air thick with the mingled scent of herbs and oil, rain-soaked leather, and resentment. Only a single desk lamp cut through the gloom, a small pool of golden light spilling across a scarred wooden table. Beneath that glow lay a mess of maps, old photographs, and printouts, Beacon Hills rendered in lines and circles of red ink. Routes, safe zones, and faces. The Hales, faces. Edward leaned over the table, his palms flat against its surface, eyes scanning the familiar patterns until they blurred. His reflection wavered faintly in a glass of untouched whiskey beside him. He didn't remember pouring it. He didn't remember sitting down. The whole night had been a blur of silence and waiting, and Edward had never been good at either. For weeks now, Chris had been quiet. Too quiet. No new orders. No targets. No retaliation after the last attack that left 2 hunters dead. Just patience, that dangerous, useless word Chris had started to use more often lately. Patience, as if it could fill the graves or stop the next full moon from rising. A luxury Edward no longer believed in. Around him, half a dozen hunters sat in mismatched chairs, their expressions tight, their bodies restless. The soft scrape of boots on the floor, the click of a lighter, the low murmur of unease, all of it built into a quiet storm that filled the safehouse like static. None of them dared say it aloud, but the thought moved through them like a shared pulse. Chris has changed. He's lost his edge. Edward heard it in every shifting glance, every clenched jaw. He didn't argue with it. Then, breaking the stagnant air, a faint buzz rattled across the table. His phone. An unknown number. The others looked up, alert but silent. Edward hesitated, just a breath, before picking it up and stepping out into the narrow hallway. The old floorboards creaked under his boots. He pressed the phone to his ear. Who is this? The reply came through a haze of distortion, a voice filtered and mechanical, but steady. Calm. Calculated. You don't know me, Edward. But I know you. I know what drives you. You're the only one left with the will to act while your leader hides behind excuses. Edward's back straightened. The voice was unfamiliar, but it carried the sharp edge of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. If this is some kind of joke. It's no joke, the voice interrupted, smooth and deliberate. You've been chasing ghosts. The Hales didn't kill your men. Edward froze. What? It wasn't them. It was Isaac Leahy. The boy running with Malia Hale and the Lockwood kid. He's the one who spilled your brother's blood. Silence hung between them, heavy as the thunder gathering outside. Edward's grip on the phone tightened until his knuckles went white. You're lying, he said, but the edge in his voice faltered, just slightly. The distorted voice pressed on, slow and poisonous. Chris knows. He found proof, real evidence. But he's hiding it. Protecting the boy. Ask him if you have the stomach for the answer. Edward's breath came shorter. His mind raced through memories, Chris's evasions, his rules, the way he'd started talking about patience and understanding. Words that sounded like weakness. His jaw clenched. Why tell me this? A soft chuckle drifted through the line, low and mocking. Because Beacon Hills deserves hunters who hunt. Not ones who sit and wait for permission. Then the line went dead. For a long moment, Edward just stood there in the dark hallway, the phone still pressed to his ear, the words echoing in the hollow space of his chest. Chris knows. Protecting him. Hunters who hunt. He closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, the decision already forming before he could talk himself out of it. When he returned to the main room, the others looked up. Their faces were a mirror of his own thoughts, tension and exhaustion twisted into something sharper. What was that? One of them asked, voice low but eager. Edward placed his phone on the table, the sound of it hitting the wood loud in the silence. He looked at each of them, one by one, eyes hard. If Chris won't do anything, he said, then we will. A murmur rippled through the room, not surprise, but grim approval. Something old and dangerous stirred in their eyes, the kind of resolve that came from loss. Edward pulled a folded map from the edge of the table and spread it open. His pen circled a point near the outskirts of town, a small mark beneath the rain-streaked window. Isaac Leahy, he said quietly. He's young, but don't underestimate him. A werewolf, and a killer. According to reports he's already taken 2 of ours. We move clean and quiet. No mistakes. No witnesses. One of the hunters shifted, uneasy. And Chris. Edward didn't look up. His voice dropped to something cold and final. Chris doesn't need to know. Outside, the rain began to fall harder, drumming against the windows in steady rhythm, a heartbeat for the storm that was coming. Far across town, in a dim apartment filled with flickering shadows, Tony, in Darren's face and skin, leaned back in his chair, phone still warm in his palm. A slow smile crossed his lips. Humans, he murmured, leaning back in his chair. So easy to stir. The parasite's eyes glimmered faintly in the dark, alive, aware, almost amused. Outside, the thunder rolled closer, and Beacon Hills held its breath. The conflicts began again. Chapter 138, The Hunt in the Woods. The late afternoon sun bled across the forest canopy, threading its dying light through the leaning columns of pine and oak. Shafts of gold sliced through the undergrowth, igniting motes of dust and drawing long, slanted bars of shadow that made the woods seem both sacred and dangerous. Each movement came alive in that fractured light, a curl of leaves, the flick of a tail, the soft whisper of intent before motion. Through that shifting glow, Malia and Isaac moved. To any outsider, they might have looked like predators in play, two wolves testing instinct and reaction. But there was no laughter, no shared amusement in their eyes. This was training done in survival's name, sharp and unrelenting. Malia lunged, claws flashing in a brief golden shimmer. Isaac twisted sideways at the last second, breath ripping from his chest as he barely avoided her strike. Her claws raked through the space his throat had occupied a heartbeat earlier, slicing nothing but the wind. Better, she said, circling him, voice calm but edged with challenge. But you still telegraph your retreats. You fall back like prey that's already surrendered. You have to move like a predator, deliberate, calculating. Never give ground without purpose. Isaac wiped a streak of sweat from his brow, his chest rising and falling fast. Little difficult, he muttered, when the so-called lesson plan involves you trying to shred my face off. Malia's mouth curved. Then stop making it so easy. He couldn't help the grin that followed, tired, crooked, but genuine. The tension between them softened for the briefest instant. He lunged again, no hesitation now, and she caught his rhythm with familiar ease. The clearing filled with the soft percussion of footfalls, breath, and the low rustle of pine needles underfoot. For a fleeting moment, it almost felt normal, the usual rhythm of training, the unspoken trust built between teacher and student. The air smelled of sap and damp soil, of forest life continuing unseen. Then the wind shifted. Malia froze mid-motion, her muscles going rigid as instinct surged to the forefront. Her nostrils flared, eyes flicking toward the west. Do you smell that? Isaac paused, catching it a moment later, something acrid, metallic beneath the natural scents of the woods. His brow furrowed. Leather, and oil. The first arrow hissed out of the shadows, grazing past his ear to lodge in an ancient tree trunk with a dull thunk. Both of them ducked low at once, instincts honed from too many encounters like this one. Malia's eyes blazed amber, her lips parting on a low growl. Hunters. The forest erupted around them. The attack came from all directions, coordinated, precise, and merciless. Edward's hunters moved like ghost silhouettes among the trees, spreading with military efficiency. There were no warnings this time, no missed shots. Flash bangs cracked through the air, white light splintering vision, ringing painfully through sensitive hearing. Isaac's world tilted from the blast, and before he could recover, Malia had thrown herself against him, driving them both to the ground just as another arrow screamed through the space where his chest had been. Move, she barked, her voice raw with urgency. They ran, darting through a chaos of bark and leaves, each breath searing their lungs. Bolts and arrows tore after them, splintering branches and kicking up dirt. Isaac shifted mid-run, muscles flexing, claws extending, ears pricked wide to the rhythm of pursuit. But even enhanced strength and speed couldn't mask reality, there were too many of them. The hunters had herded them with surgical precision, closing the net tighter until the tree line fell away into a narrow clearing littered with traps. A wire caught Isaac's ankle, jerking him off balance. Before he could right himself, Malia spun and tore it apart with her claws, but a dart struck her shoulder before she finished the motion. A sharp sting, followed by heat. Wolfsbane. She ripped it free with a snarl, but already her limbs felt heavier, slower. Branches shifted to reveal Edward, emerging from the darkness like the forest itself had conjured him. His crossbow was poised, his eyes cold and unflinching. Malia Hale. Isaac Leahy, he said, his voice measured but dripping with contained malice. Exactly who I was hoping to find. Isaac crouched low, eyes glinting gold, every nerve ready to strike, and then 3 red laser dots appeared on his chest. Don't, Malia rasped, her breath shallow, the poison dragging her down. The air went still but tense, as if the forest were holding its breath. Isaac's expression burned with defiance. For a second, it looked like he might ignore her and attack anyway. But he exhaled slowly and let the transformation fade, shoulders squaring as he met Edward's gaze. You're making a mistake, he said quietly. Edward's face didn't change. Oh, I've made plenty, he replied. Trusting the Hales was one of them. I won't repeat it. A younger hunter, face pale beneath streaks of camouflage paint, hesitated. Why not just kill him and be done with it? Edward's jaw clenched. He holstered the crossbow, stepping closer until he could look Isaac in the eye. Isaac Leahy might be the one who actually killed our people, he said evenly, but he's just a boy. I'm sure it was the Hales that ordered him to do it. He turned to his people. Once we get his confession, Chris won't be able to ignore this anymore. He'll have to choose. And when he does, we'll finally end the Hales for good. Before Isaac could respond, Edward lifted his crossbow, the motion smooth and practiced, and sent a dart straight into Isaac's shoulder. The wolfsbane spread fast, freezing his limbs before pain had even fully registered. Two hunters broke off to seize him, dragging his limp frame upright. Another reached for Malia, hauling her to her knees before forcing her arms back. Even drugged, she glared up at Edward with pure hatred burning through the haze. Edward gave the clearing one last slow glance, his eyes sweeping the broken branches, the scattered arrows, the sinking gold light of day's end. Then, with a brief signal, the hunters moved out, merging once again with the trees, silent as ghosts, efficient as machines. When they were gone, the forest fell into uneasy stillness. Nothing remained but the echo of retreating footsteps and the faint, bitter tang of wolfsbane, twisting through the dying light like the memory of violence itself. Chapter 139, The Lodge. Isaac woke to the bite of cold metal against his skin. His wrists ached, the cuffs digging deep enough to bruise. Every small movement sent a sting through the tender flesh beneath the iron. The air was thick with the sharp, acrid scent of wolfsbane, a smell that burned the back of his throat and made his lungs feel too small for his chest. Moisture clung to the walls and the floor, the whole room breathing dampness like an old lung that had forgotten how to work. Across from him, Malia stirred. A low growl caught in her throat, not loud enough to be a threat, but enough to remind the world she wasn't helpless. Her hair clung to her temples, her eyes half open, flicking from the shadows to Isaac and back again. Beneath them, the floorboards moaned as if protesting their presence, the weight of the building's age pressing down. It was less a room than a grave dressed in wood and dust. The place must have been a hunter's lodge once, years, maybe decades ago. The walls still bore its history. Cracked photographs, warped plaques, and hunting trophies mounted like ghosts. The glass eyes of deer, bears, and wolves stared down from the rotting beams, watching them as though bearing witness to one more cruel ritual. Cobwebs framed the windows where weak light struggled to enter, barely cutting through the gloom. Edward stood a few feet away, his silhouette carved out by the dying amber light leaking through the window behind him. His figure looked sharper in the dim, a soldier's outline, not a hunter's. Shoulders squared, jaw locked, his every movement seemed measured, deliberate. The weight of command clung to him even here, surrounded by decay. He spoke with the precision of someone who'd already rehearsed every word. Isaac Leahy, he began, his tone clipped and cold. You killed 2 of my people. Why? The words struck like the crack of a rifle. Isaac's throat was dry, his voice rasping when he tried to speak. I didn't. The interruption came like lightning. Edward's hand slammed down on the table between them, the impact ringing through the hollow room. Don't insult me, he snapped. We found proof all over the scene. Your blood. Your claw marks. You want to tell me that wasn't you? Isaac forced himself to meet Edward's gaze. His eyes didn't flinch, though the truth felt useless on his tongue. It wasn't me, he said quietly. Something was messing with me. Some kind of parasite, an organism. It got inside my head. Took control. I wasn't myself. Edward's expression barely shifted. Only the faintest curl of his lip betrayed what he was thinking, a mixture of scorn and weary pity. Parasite, he repeated, like the word itself tasted bad. That's the story the Hales fed you, isn't it? Convenient. The killer always finds a new monster to blame. Before Isaac could defend himself, Malia's voice cut through the tension, sharp, cold, and burning with defiance. You sound just like Gerard, she said. Same arrogance. Same obsession. You think killing us makes you a hero. Edward turned his head slowly toward her. His expression tightened, a small flicker of anger breaking through the discipline. But he didn't rise to the bait. When he finally spoke, his tone was quieter, too controlled. Gerard was a visionary. He understood what your cursed family is capable of. I'm just finishing what he started. Then you're his shadow, Malia said, eyes hard as glass. Nothing more than his echo. For the briefest heartbeat, something human crossed Edward's face, a momentary crack in the armor. Doubt, maybe. Regret. But just as quickly, it vanished, sealed under the familiar weight of conviction. He turned his gaze back to Isaac. You can make this easy, Edward Said. Admit it. Say the words. Tell me you killed them on the Hales, orders. Isaac lowered his eyes, studying the worn grooves in the table between them. His voice came out tired, almost detached. If I say it, will you believe me? Edward hesitated, only for a moment, but it was enough. The silence that followed answered for him. Isaac leaned back against the chair, the cuffs biting deeper into his wrists. Then it doesn't matter what I say. The air thickened between them, heavy with something unspoken. Edward stood there, watching them both for a long moment, long enough for the faint creak of the lodge to fill the gap where words failed. At last, he stepped back, the tension in his body shifting toward cold resolution. You'll talk eventually, he said quietly. You always do. Then he turned and walked out. The door slammed behind him with a finality that made the whole lodge tremble, the echo beating through the walls like a fading pulse. Malia exhaled through her nose, testing the strength of the chains that bound her. The metal didn't give. He's not going to listen, she muttered. Isaac nodded faintly, eyes still on the door. I know. For the first time since waking, Malia's sarcasm slipped. Her voice came out lower, almost human. Then we need another way out. Silence settled again, thicker this time, not just the absence of sound, but the weight of realization. Somewhere in the distance, a floorboard creaked. A drop of water fell from the ceiling. They both went still, listening. Not to Edward's footsteps anymore, but to the building itself, to its breathing, its secrets. Waiting for the one sound that meant their captors had let their guard down. Waiting for their chance. Chapter 140, Breaking Point. The clock on Chris Argent's wall ticked past midnight, each second sounding louder in the stillness of his office. The lamplight cast long, tired shadows across the paperwork scattered over his desk, reports, patrol maps, names of the dead. He hadn't left the chair in hours. His coffee had gone cold hours ago. The phone buzzed against the wood, breaking the silence. The name glowing on the screen made his stomach clench. Edward. He stared at it for a long moment, a pulse of unease crawling up his spine. When he finally answered, his voice was steady, controlled, the calm of a man used to walking on the edge of chaos. Edward, he said quietly. I told you to be patient. The reply came like a spark against gasoline, sharp, breathless, full of conviction and anger. We've got them, Edward Said. The Hale girl and the Leahy boy. We'll get the truth out of them, one way or another. Chris shot to his feet, the chair scraping hard against the floor. His jaw tightened, fury simmering beneath the surface. You went against my orders. He demanded, every word clipped and cold. You took my hunters. I took our hunters, Edward snapped back. Someone had to do what you wouldn't. Those things killed our people, Chris. How long were you planning to wait? How many more graves before you did something? Chris's pulse pounded in his ears. All you've done, he said, voice low and shaking with restrained anger, is light a fuse you can't control. Edward's tone turned hard, triumphant, almost. You'll thank me when we get the proof. Then the line went dead. Chris lowered the phone slowly, staring at it as if it might give him a different ending. The silence that followed was heavy, not peaceful, but accusing. The house around him felt colder somehow, filled with the ghosts of every decision he'd made, every order he'd given, every life that had been lost because of them. He didn't notice the faint creak from upstairs, a whisper of movement, the soft betrayal of a loose floorboard. At the top of the stairs, Allison froze, heart in her throat. She had only caught pieces of the conversation, muffled through the floorboards, but it was enough. We've got them. The Leahy boy. The Hale girl. A confession. Her stomach twisted into knots. Isaac. Her breath came too fast as she backed away from the banister, retreating into the dim hallway. The weight of what she'd just heard pressed down on her chest like a physical thing. She could still hear her father's voice downstairs, calm, deliberate, trying to keep control, but it didn't matter. Uncle Edward had already gone too far. She slipped into her room and closed the door softly behind her. The air felt thick, heavy with the scent of gun oil and memory, her bow in the corner, her mother's pendant on the dresser, the legacy of the Argents all around her. For a long moment, she just stood there, shaking. Her father was fighting to prevent another war. Edward was already waging one. And she was caught in the middle. Allison grabbed her phone. Her thumb hovered over the screen, trembling. This was betrayal, not just of Edward, but of her father, of everything she'd been raised to believe in. Hunters didn't turn on hunters. But the image that came to her mind wasn't of her family, it was of Isaac. His shy, uncertain smile. The quiet way he listened. The bruises that never quite faded from memory. Her throat tightened. She pressed call. Lucas. She whispered. The voice on the other end was low, steady, and instantly alert. Allison. She swallowed hard, her voice cracking. They've got them, Isaac and Malia. Some of the hunters, they captured them. My dad's furious, but they won't tell him where. He doesn't know. Allison, slow down. But she couldn't. The words tumbled out, desperate and raw. Just find them. Please. Before it's too late. There was a pause, a sharp inhale, the weight of 1,000 questions unasked, but before Lucas could respond, she ended the call. The silence that followed was deafening. Allison stared down at the phone in her hands. Her reflection blurred in the tears she hadn't realized were falling. She locked the screen, set it aside, and sat heavily on the edge of the bed. Please, she whispered to the dark, voice trembling, don't make me regret this. Outside, the wind rose, moving through the trees like a warning. The scent of rain drifted through the open window, sharp, electric. Somewhere beyond the quiet streets and dark woods, thunder rolled. And with it came the promise of war. Chapter 141, The Trail. The forest was silent when Lucas arrived, that uneasy kind of silence that follows violence, when even nature seems to hold its breath. The usual sounds of life had vanished, no rustle of wings, no distant chatter of sparrows. Even the wind moved differently here, slipping cautiously through the trees as if afraid to disturb what had happened. The clearing ahead bore the faint scars of struggle. Near the roots of a gnarled oak, buried beneath a thin skin of soil and damp leaves, Malia's phone gave off a dim blue glow, the cracked screen flickering like a dying heartbeat. Lucas crouched beside it, brushing away the earth with careful fingers. The soil was still soft, still unsettled, a recent disturbance. Around him, the forest told its story in fragments, arrow shafts snapped clean in two, claw marks gouged deep into the bark, and the lingering, acrid tang of wolfsbane, bitter and poisonous, curling through the cold air like smoke. The scent bit at his nose and tongue, an invisible warning of pain and poison both. He pressed a hand to the ground, feeling the shallow grooves etched into the earth, long, dragging marks that spoke of resistance, of something or someone being pulled. Heavy boots had crushed the leaves flat in one direction. There were two sets of trails overlapping, one staggered, one steady. A struggle, then movement. He traced the story with his eyes, following the rhythm of each indentation like reading a grim, wordless poem written in dirt and blood. Malia, you clever girl, he thought. The phone's placement wasn't random, it was angled just so, properly hidden but still sending out a faint signal. The hunters might have missed it, but Lucas hadn't. She'd known someone would come looking. She'd known he'd track her. Lucas rose to his feet, drawing in a long, steady breath through his nose. Beneath the chemical sting of wolfsbane, other layers revealed themselves, the faint metallic tang of Isaac's blood, the sharper, more human scent of fierce sweat, and the synthetic sterility of the usual hunter fabric. The forest was a labyrinth of odors, each telling part of a larger, darker truth. He took out his phone, thumbed Isaac's contact. One ring. Then nothing. The screen went black. A dead signal. He checked the tracker, one flicker, then darkness. Disabled. Of course. The hunters didn't leave traces behind, they erased them. Sliding the phone back into his pocket, Lucas let his eyes fall closed. He breathed in again, slower this time, opening himself fully to the murmurs of the forest. He felt the tremor of air moving between the trees, the subtle vibrations in the earth, the faint echoes of movement carried on the wind. The woods spoke to him in their own ancient language, and he listened until the direction became clear. North. He started running. The forest blurred around him, the rhythm of his body syncing with the pulse of the land. His feet struck the earth in a steady cadence, a low drumbeat echoing through the dark. Cold air filled his lungs, burning slightly with each inhale. Branches whipped past, scraping against his arms and shoulders. He vaulted fallen logs, ducked under low limbs, and moved like a ghost through the underbrush, following the phantom scent trail that grew weaker with every mile. As he ran, the forest changed. The trees grew older here, trunks thicker, bark darker, their roots coiling like serpents through the soil. The canopy thickened until the sky vanished entirely, swallowing him in shades of green and gray. The air itself felt heavier, the silence more absolute, as if the forest were watching. Then, a new scent cut through the damp earth and pine, oil and steel. A metallic tang carried on the wind. Human machinery. Moments later, he caught another note, the smoky burn of kerosene. His pace slowed. Hunters. Lucas crouched low, sinking behind a ridge of moss-covered stone. The wind shifted, and with it came the faint murmur of voices. He couldn't make out the words, but their rhythm carried, harsh, clipped, and tired. Arguments. Orders. The tension of men who were angry, and tired. His eyes glowed faintly red in the dark. The wolf stirred beneath his skin, restless, eager. He looked ahead, scanning through the mist that coiled like breath between the pines. There, half hidden by fog and shadow, stood the outline of a cabin. Old timber. Sagging roof. A hunting lodge long abandoned, reclaimed by moss and time. Lucas's breath steadied, his muscles coiled in readiness. Beneath the human calm, the animal part of him rose, keen and silent. Hold on, Malia. Isaac. He stepped forward, one soundless stride at a time, the forest closing in around him once more, its silence no longer empty, but expectant. Chapter 142, The Silent Storm. The old lodge sat brooding at the northern edge of the forest, a decaying relic of another age. Its timbers had long surrendered to damp and frost, warped and bitten by time, yet the heart of its structure still clung to stubborn life. Once it had been a proud hunting retreat, a gathering place for men who drank, laughed, and told stories of conquest around roaring fires. Now it stood hollow and forgotten, a carcass of wood and iron, its spirit drowned beneath the smell of wolfsbane, oil, and the lingering residue of bloodlust heavy in the air. The windows were blinded by grime, and from within came the faint scent of fear masked by smoke. The night pressed close around it. Mist curled through the trees, carrying whispers of rain and the metallic tang of thunder. Beneath that hush, something moved, silent, deliberate. Lucas moved through the surrounding underbrush like a living shadow. Each step melted into silence, his body a seamless extension of the night. Every movement was measured, deliberate, and deadly. The forest whispered around him, the rustle of damp leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, the low rumble of the clouds. Lightning stirred beneath his skin, an electric pulse yearning to escape, crackling faintly like a caged storm he barely contained. He forced it down with practiced control, steadying his breath. The mission demanded precision, not chaos. Just ahead, two hunters stood guard near the back entrance, their silhouettes barely discernible in the dim light filtering from within. They leaned lazily against the wall, crossbows hanging loose across their shoulders. Their conversation was muted but tense, whispers about new orders, about Edward losing patience, and about how he wasn't taking any more of Chris's crap. Their laughter was short, brittle, and nervous, the kind that dies too quickly. Lucas didn't wait. He struck between heartbeats. One instant he was crouched in the dark, the next he materialized behind them, silent, spectral, hands hovering inches from the exposed skin between collar and spine. A flicker of blue light rippled through the air, followed by a hushed crack, barely audible yet final. Both men stiffened, eyes wide, muscles locking as the current surged through their bodies. A second later, they dropped wordlessly to the forest floor. No shout. No struggle. Only the soft thud of collapsing weight and the faint ozone tang of spent lightning. He dragged their bodies into the shadows, concealment born of habit more than mercy. Then he paused, still as a statue. Inside the stale air of the lodge, every sound carried differently, sharper, nearer. He extended his senses outward, letting perception bloom. Heartbeats painted the darkness in rhythm, 12 distinct pulses. Two steady but quickened, fearful, restrained. Malia and Isaac. The rest, 10 strong, deliberate, armed, hunters. Edward's voice threaded through the silence, calm and composed, carrying authority like a sharpened knife. Keep the wolfsbane close and ready. Don't give them a chance to shift. Lucas's jaw tightened as he crept along the lodge's outer wall. Through a grime-smeared window, he caught sight of Isaac tied to a chair, bruised but unbroken, eyes lit with defiance. Malia knelt nearby, iron cuffs biting into her wrists, her muscles tensed with contained fury. Their captors moved mechanically, checking weapons, whispering orders, oblivious to the gathering danger outside. Lucas began his approach to the door, muscles coiled, lightning simmering low, when the fragile equilibrium shattered. From within came a metallic snap, sharp as a rifle crack. Then splintering glass, followed by a pulse of raw, feral energy that rippled through the air like a shockwave. Malia had broken free. Almost instantly, the faint threads of old magic woven around the building blazed red-hot. The alarm rune ignited, its sigil pulsing violently before bursting into a screeching wail that tore through the night, metal screaming alive as blood surged in every living body. Hunters reacted at once. Someone shouted, "She's loose." Others grabbed weapons, the scrape of boots and steel filling the air. Lucas froze in place, pulse steady amid the chaos. Inside, 10 heartbeats spiked in unison. Windows flared with movement. Hunters pivoted toward exits, weapons raised, voices overlapping in panicked orders. The hunt's quiet had ended. But Lucas did not falter. His face remained carved from calm, though the world around him seemed to bend. The air shimmered, alive with growing tension. Lightning crawled up his arms in restless strands, climbing his neck and pulsing bright beneath his skin. The glow spread, burnishing his outline with light too fierce to belong to anything mortal. When he looked up again, his eyes were no longer human, they blazed with steady crimson fire. The storm that had waited patiently in silence had finally arrived. Chapter 143, Storm. The lodge was chaos, chaos confined, pressed tight between wood and blood and the faint scent of wolfsbane. The alarm rune had barely finished screaming before the front door ceased to exist. It didn't break, didn't splinter, it detonated. Shards of oak scattered across the entryway like shrapnel, smoke curling in from the winter air outside. Through that smoke came Lucas, silent, deliberate, unstoppable. He didn't rush, he moved, a dark shape threaded with faint light. His claws shimmered faintly, charged with the low hum of restrained power, like a storm about to break. Every step carried weight. Every breath felt electric. The first hunter never even registered him as human. There was a blur, a whisper of motion, and then the hunter was gone, collapsing bonelessly to the floor before the sound of impact even reached the others. The second hunter managed a shot. A steel bolt sliced through the haze toward Lucas's chest, only for his hand to flick out, impossibly fast, catching the projectile midair and tossing it aside as though swatting a mosquito. Then came the shouting, commands barked in panic, boots thudding on wood, weapons being loaded and cocked. The hunters spread out, training dictating their every move. But training meant nothing against what faced them now. They weren't men fighting another man, they were soldiers trying to cage a hurricane. Every strike that landed slid harmlessly aside. Every bolt missed by inches, every blade stopped by reflexes honed beyond human comprehension. Lucas didn't fight for blood, he fought to end movement, to end resistance. By the time the fifth man hit the ground, the remaining hunters faltered. By the seventh, hesitation curdled into fear. And still, Lucas didn't kill. He didn't need to. When the last hunter lunged at him, desperation outweighing sense, Lucas caught the man by the collar and slammed him into the wall. The wood cracked, the man went limp before sliding to the floor, unconscious before his weapon even fell from his hand. Silence followed, deep and strange. Only the moans of the fallen and the soft hum of the extinguished alarm remained. The tension in the air began to fade, the charged pulse of violence ebbing away. But deeper inside the lodge, behind a locked steel door, the real storm hadn't ended. It was just getting started. Malia ducked as Edward's blade sliced through the air, missing her throat by an inch. The edge kissed her arm instead, the wolfsbane coating sizzling where it met her blood. Pain lanced up her skin, sharp, venomous, but she didn't let it slow her. She couldn't afford to. She wasn't fighting to win. Not yet. She was fighting to buy time. Before the confrontation, she'd already managed to weaken the restraints holding Isaac. Isaac sat bound to a reinforced chair, wrists rubbed raw from struggling, blood seeping down his arms. His eyes were distant but alive, waiting. Malia ducked another swing, rolled across the floor, and kicked upward. Edward's knife went spinning from his grip, metal skittering across the floorboards. He cursed and reached for his crossbow, but Malia was already there, grabbing his wrist and twisting hard until the bone popped. He roared and punched her square in the jaw, sending her staggering back. She spat blood, smiled. Behind Edward, the final strands of Isaac's bindings began to give way. There was a snap, quiet but decisive. "Hey," Isaac rasped, voice rough but laced with fury. "Remember me." Edward turned just in time to catch Isaac's fist. The punch landed like thunder, sending the hunter flying backward into a table. Wood splintered, tools scattered, and Edward rolled onto his side with a groan, spitting crimson onto the floor. He grinned through the blood, Gerard's old grin, hateful and hungry. "You think you're monsters," he hissed. "I've hunted worse." "Then you've been hunting the wrong things," Malia shot back, eyes burning. What followed wasn't elegant. It wasn't cinematic. It was raw, vicious, and real. Edward fought like a man who had studied their kind his whole life, every strike aimed to maim, every step measured and efficient. He knew where to hit, how to move, how to make every ounce of his strength count. But Malia and Isaac weren't fighting to prove anything. They were fighting to survive. Wolfsbane slowed their reflexes, exhaustion tugged at their muscles, but instinct drowned out everything else. Isaac blocked a blade meant for Malia's heart. Malia swept Edward's legs when he tried to pin Isaac down. They moved in sync, not perfectly, but desperately, each covering the other's weakness. Every breath hurt. Every second stretched. Finally, when Edward's arm came up for a killing strike, Isaac caught his wrist and held it there. Malia darted in behind, her claws flashing, slashing across his chest. Not deep, just enough. Enough to stop him. Edward gasped, dropped to one knee, then another. His blade clattered beside him. For a moment, defiance flickered in his eyes, then it went dark as he collapsed forward, unconscious. Isaac stood trembling, chest heaving, blood mixing with sweat. Malia's hands were shaking too, her knuckles bruised and slick with red. "Should have stayed with Chris," Isaac muttered. Malia gave a short, shaky laugh. Remind me never to train with you again. He smiled weakly. Deal. They pushed the door open together. The hallway beyond looked like a battlefield, walls cracked, glass shattered, the floor slick with dust and blood. Smoke drifted through the ruin like a ghost. And in the middle of it stood Lucas. Untouched. Calm. Eyes faintly red beneath the flickering light. Around him, silence and aftermath. The hunters sprawled across the floor, groaning or still. The air stank of iron and ozone. Malia's breath caught. You did all this. Lucas turned his head slightly, the glow in his eyes dimming as his power settled. I knocked. Isaac just stared, half in disbelief, half in awe. Lucas's gaze swept over the fallen hunters once more, his expression unreadable. Then, softly, he said, let's go. Before the rest wake up. They stepped out into the cold night air, the forest breathing around them. In the distance, thunder rolled across the hills, deep and rumbling, as if the storm had only paused, waiting for the next strike. Because in Beacon Hills, storms never really ended. They just changed shape. To be continued.